So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2018-2019 Lectures in Catholic Experience. And I want to extend a very special welcome to any of you who are here for the first time. We're very glad that you could join us and happy to be with us this evening. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We give thanks for the privilege to work and to live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities in order to enhance our own knowledge and to learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. My name is Christina Vanine, and I am coordinating this year's lecture series. Before we get started, if you haven't already done so, may I ask you to just turn off whatever device you might have in your pocket or with you, please and thank you. Thank you. About 10 years ago now, I had the privilege to contribute to a book entitled Feminist Theology with a Canadian Accent. Together, all the chapters in that volume tell the stories of the many incredible women across this country who have had the courage to be involved in the work of overcoming the impact of sexism and patriarchy in our society and in our churches. Like our speaker this evening, I chose to look at Canadian women's religious communities, but in particular in terms of the many ways in which these communities are responding to the ecological crisis. I was struck by the ways in which these communities have been striving to be important models of justice in all areas of life, including ecological justice. They are reflective of what Maura Ryan says about the value and significance of religious communities. She says, communities which have been able to maintain distinctive stories and traditions of value will be critical in the formation of persons who are able to step out from the dominant shaping power of our global economy. Religious communities, by marching to the rhythm of different commitments, may well be our last best hope for promoting a new ethos of justice. These communities stand at a decisive moment of invitation and challenge. So this evening, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Christine Gervais to help us meet some of these resourceful, strategic, and resilient women religious. Dr. Gervais is an associate professor in criminology in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa. She is also a member of the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child in the Faculty of Law at the university. Her teaching and research areas include children's and women's rights in Latin America, social justice, the collateral consequences to relatives of youth who have sexually offended, as well as gender-based discrimination and criminalization in religious institutions. Her interdisciplinary work has been published in a variety of journals, including the Sociology of Religion, Criminologie, Canadian Women's Studies, Children and Society, and the Journal of Youth Studies. And as you know, she is the author of the book that is the inspiration for tonight's lecture, Beyond the Altar, Women Religious, Patriarchal Power, and the Church, which was published this year by Wilfrid Laurier Press. And if that's not enough work, Dr. Gervais is also the founder of Acceso Internacional, an organization whose mandate is to promote and enable greater access to all levels of education for young people in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Gervais to speak to us on the topic, Beyond the Altar, Canadian Women Religious Confront Patriarchal Power in the Roman Catholic Church.
Thank you, Professor Vanine, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to Marilyn Caird, who helped with a lot of logistical preparation, the IT staff, and to the sponsors who have enabled this evening to take place. and to you, the audience members, for dedicating your Friday evening to exploring how women religious have faced gender inequality as part of their Catholic experience. I begin by echoing Professor Vanin's acknowledgement of the traditional territory in this region. I would like to add that I live, raise my children, and work on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. We are grateful for the Indigenous people who continue to care and remain interconnected with this land. Yet in light of the continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples, in my Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, we commit ourselves to the work of reconciliation and decolonization, which demands, among many other things, that we transform the way justice is done, as is emphasized by the peace and justice theme of this lecture series. In relation to this, I would like to clarify that the sisters who I interviewed do sincerely acknowledge the role that the Roman Catholic Church has played in the apprehension of Indigenous children into residential schools and during the 60s scoop. They are very aware and critical of the detrimental repercussions of colonization and of the importance of reconciliation. I'm pleased to be here tonight because the first time I spoke about my book in the spring at the first launch at the university, I was very nervous and quite emotional in front of quite a mixed audience that included relatives, friends, neighbors, colleagues, community members. I was emotional in part because it was a very meaningful project that had come to fruition. I had had the opportunity to work with incredible women and had grown on a daily basis in working with their transcriptions and with their own words in terms of spirituality and social justice. So it was quite meaningful on many levels. And just shortly before the book launch, one of the sisters had passed away. And so there were just many layers to these emotions. Plus, on one side of the room was sitting the Vice Dean of Graduate Studies from my Faculty of Social Science, it was on this side of the room, and the Associate Director of my Department of Criminology. And these are colleagues who collaborate together, and they refer to me as the Mother Teresa of the University of Ottawa. On the other side of the room sat my relatives, including my parents, husband, sons, a sister-in-law, a niece, and I was half humorously yet nervously worried about potential conversations during the reception that may involve my family revealing all the ways in which I was not Mother Teresa. But thankfully tonight, I think in this room, there may be a relatively safe space, although I can't speak to what may be happening in conversations and tweets online with the live streaming. So yes, I'm especially pleased and grateful to be here this evening because your very presence and your attentiveness, and hopefully your attentiveness, indicates that you're interested in and open to equality, peace, and justice, principles and practice that I think represent the priorities of the women religious that I will speak about tonight. And as I was reflecting on the principles of equality, peace, and justice, I was reminded of the statement from Pope Francis that inspired this lecture series. And so if you permit me, I would like to read it, and I will read it a second time with a substitution. So according to the description for the lecture series, in a 2015 audience with children of the Peace Factory, Pope Francis stated that we are all equal, all of us. But this truth is not recognized. This equality is not recognized. When we do not see this, society is unjust. It does not follow the rule of justice, and where there is no justice, there is no peace. So if you allow me to revise this by substituting the word society with the word church, it would read, we are all equal, all of us, but this truth is not recognized. This equality is not recognized. When we do not see this, the church is unjust. It does not follow the rule of justice, and where there is no justice, there cannot be peace. And this is part of the inspiration of the entire project leading up to the book, as well as for what I will share with you this evening. So I would like to begin by explaining my interest in women religious, and then part of the criminological connections that I see related to this as well. So for as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in sisters. One could say that it's literally a lifelong interest that began the day that I was born. Due to my fragile state at birth, it was determined that I should be baptized immediately. Otherwise, as the church teachings imply, I would have spent my afterlife in limbo instead of in heaven. Thus, in the absence of a priest, I was baptized by a sister, and I lived. While I was always proud that I was baptized by a woman and a woman religious, she was always constructed, and always negatively so, by others as the alternative to the male priest. Her secondary status both puzzled and bothered me. And later on, after observing instances of sexism within the Roman Catholic Church, I came to more fully realize how women's subordination was systematically entrenched within the institutional church. Yet while I was also always concerned for women religious' place within the church, I was simultaneously impressed by their contributions. I became intrigued by their open-mindedness and their inclusive approaches that I presume that many people neither were aware of nor would believe due to the popularized stereotypical assumptions of Catholic nuns. So I set out to discover and document what Ontario-based women religious have both endured and accomplished. And if you would permit me some additional time in sharing an anecdote that I think is related to the Christmas season. When I was confirming the details of the sister-based circumstances surrounding my birth in preparation for the book, I had shared a draft of the preface with my parents. And after reading this, my mother had shared another birth-related occurrence that I had never heard before, at least I didn't recall hearing. So I always knew that I had stayed in the hospital for about 5 weeks after my birth to gain sufficient weight and strength so that I could be discharged safely. And my mother had always told me, or often spoke about, the ways in which the sister nurses had often competitively taken turns to care for me in terms of feeding and rocking me to sleep and so on. But I didn't recall ever hearing what had occurred on Christmas Day. And parental visits, please bear in mind, were limited because my family lived a distance from the hospital in a rural setting, and my parents were busy raising or taking care of my older sister, 1-year-old older sister, and my twin, who went home before I did. And as the story goes, a nun called my parents on Christmas Day to let them know that I was doing fine. She also delighted, and this is probably the purpose of the call, delighted in informing my mother that as the sisters celebrated in their residence at the hospital, they were celebrating and having their Christmas dinner. They had placed me in the manger as the baby Jesus. As I heard the story, I thought immediately of how through that loving act, the sisters had feminized the Christ child, the so-called Son of God. Of course, without their input, I cannot speculate about whether or not the sisters' intentions were feminist, but I cannot help but wonder how they reacted to the gendered implications of their gesture in 1970, a time when gendered restrictions against women in the Catholic Church were quite pronounced. My mind was drawn instantly to the sisters' feminist actions that I had come to know through interview conversations. I could not help but smile as I realized how in my time as the baby girl in the manger, I had personally been at the very center of one of the sisters' numerous efforts to feminize and feminist the Christian celebrations and spaces. While the connection was apparent to me now, little did the sisters know back then that the infant girl whom they placed in the manger would someday write about them and their feminine and feminist spirituality. Yet I cannot help but ponder the meaningful interconnection and wonder if perhaps they somehow did know, either by faith, formula, or fortitude, that they were weaving our journeys together that would lead eventually to the challenges, questions, and critiques that I shed light upon in terms of their gendered condition. I'm often asked how this project is related to my work in criminology. So I'm anticipating that question, and I would like to take a moment to answer it now. So for me, I think there are countless connections. One of the most obvious links for many people would be the sisters' involvement in the criminal justice system as chaplains among those who've been criminalized and imprisoned, and as you'll come to know later in this lecture series in March with the work of Sister Helen Préjean on the death penalty. They've also been invaluable supporters of those who have been victimized by harmful behavior. What I find particularly interesting in those settings is that they are involved in so much more than traditional evangelization. Many sisters facilitate a variety of leading-edge healing practices, including Reiki, which I'll speak about later, which again are a testament to their innovative and inclusive spiritual endeavors. I've also analyzed constructions of deviance and discipline among women religious in 2 ways. So first, I examined the ways in which sisters themselves engaged, and admittedly so, and humorously and mischievously so, in deviant behaviors in order to overcome the harsh discipline in convent settings in earlier times especially during their novitiate training. And so we heard many different anecdotes that, again, the humor with which they shared these and the pride with which they expressed them in the aftermath, although recognizing how stifling the circumstances were. The second way actually has to do with how women religious continue to be deviantized and disciplined by the church's clerical hierarchy, as we've witnessed recently through the targeting of outspoken sister scholars, authors, speakers, and activists, as well as through the dual investigation and apostolic visitation against sisters, religious communities, and leadership organizations within the United States. My interest in women religious also intersected with my criminological lens, when in 2010, the Vatican released a decree that led to what I refer to as the canonical criminalization of women's ordination, which, as some of you may be familiar, and if not, in this, as we know, women's ordination has been prohibited for a number of centuries. And in 2008, that prohibition was underscored by the Vatican, but in 2010, in the first decade or at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the ordination of women was considered or added to a list of grave delicts by the Vatican. So as I mentioned, I refer to this as canonical criminalization. So at a time in history, and not perfectly so, and certainly not completely so, when so many other private and governmental agencies have been working towards gender equality, especially in the context of labor conditions, the Catholic Church not only prohibits full leadership and full shared leadership within the church, but took a further step backwards and actually criminalized it and penalized it through excommunication. Part of the impetus for this project was to establish and extend a conversation across generations of women who encountered similar experiences and feelings. So I was hearing elderly sisters in their 80s and 90s express frustration with the church, but I was also hearing similar critiques by young women in their 20s. And I thought that if only the 21-year-old young woman could hear what the 91-year-old sister, who's the age of the eldest sister I interviewed, could hear that they were sharing the same concerns, the younger woman may feel validated, and that they would realize that their critiques and experiences may not only be acceptable, but also appropriate and essential questions to ask. I initiated this project and subsequently wrote the book Beyond the Altar because I felt compelled to convey both the plight and potential of women whose voices have been silenced and whose contributions are either unknown or sometimes misunderstood. So it reveals Ontario-based Canadian women religious' accounts of both obstacles and opportunities, as well as of pain and perseverance. And given that the Roman Catholic Church altars are predominantly male-dominated and are thus visible spaces of gender-based exclusion, I especially wanted to draw attention to all the locations where the women religious have created inclusive and empowering sources of spirituality and support. But before I explore a bit more of their work beyond the altar, I first want to comment on the inclusive methodology which I employed, which resonates with a lot of sisters' shifts towards more inclusive governance. So beyond my commitment to university-regulated ethical guidelines that we all have to follow, I'm also dedicated to upholding an additional level of ethical standards, and which is one that promotes partnership and reciprocity between researchers and participants. And I've learned to do this in my work in social justice and human rights and international development, primarily in Latin America. And I've drawn on the work of Harsh Mander, who cautions that we must move beyond detached, impersonal, and objective, or so-called objective social science research, whereby researchers merely extract information from people, regard them as research subjects and statistics, publish their stories, and then just walk away. Rather, he contends that listening to people's stories and their words from the heart and enabling them to analyze their own experiences empowers participants to become research partners. So such an approach was particularly relevant to my study given women religious' long-standing vulnerability and silencing in the male-dominated and hierarchical structured Catholic Church. And this approach is also echoed by many feminist scholars, including feminist sister scholars, Sandra Schneiders, for example, who shared that women's experience has been largely excluded from the history of mainline religion. And Elizabeth Johnson conveyed that the lived experience of women has been long derided and neglected in androcentric traditions. I thus endeavored to ensure that the ethics of inclusivity were upheld on a number of levels. So at the outset, the participants, or at least some of them, were involved in the preparation of the study insofar as they provided input on the questions that we were developing for the interview guide. They reviewed their transcripts, and they provided approval on the use of their quotations. And among those who took the opportunity, some raised concerns occasionally about identifying information, even though I had anonymized as much as possible, including their names, the names of their congregations, and any other potentially identifying information in terms of geographic details or buildings that they were referring to and their projects. But most actually sought to strengthen the tone of their remarks. And Sister Sarah, who was 49, the youngest sister I interviewed, when she was recognizing a particular quote, had shared that the quote could be made stronger. It just didn't feel as strong as I meant it. So can we edit this to convey my frustration a little more? So I heard many sisters in conversation expressing that intention. There were also some sisters, like 80-year-old Sister Teresa, who was concerned about some of the terminology that I was using. So for example, the word fellow, she felt that had more of a masculine tone. And I was using the word fellow because I was running out of synonyms for the words peer or colleague to refer to sisters and as shared, in their shared communities. And so when I explained that rationale, she said, I understand, that the use of that synonym, but she said, I think you should avoid using it because of the masculine elements associated with. The most memorable follow-up occurred early on in the interview process on an interview day. It was actually Sister Teresa, who I just mentioned. She seemed quite annoyed with the church's male hierarchical authorities and their presumption of gendered obedience. And apparently that frustration was so intense that about 6 hours after her early morning interview had ended, so I had spent a day at a retirement residence where I'd interviewed several sisters, one after the other, and Sister Teresa's interview had taken place first thing in the morning. So while I was awaiting for the supper, for which they insisted that I stay, again, a testament to their very generous hospitality, I heard a knock on the door of the room. And when I went to the door and I opened it, there stood Sister Teresa, 80-year-old Sister Teresa, hunched over and leaning with one hand on her walker that she had used to very carefully shuffle her way across the considerable distance between her room and mine. And given her mobility issues, the fact that she was coming and made the attempt to come demonstrated her determination. So as she held on to the walker with one hand, with the index finger of the other hand, she shook it eagerly at me and said very firmly yet enthusiastically, commanding, "Turn on your recorder, there's something else I have to tell you." For the next 20 minutes, I listened, awestruck, to Sister Teresa's captivating cri de coeur against the male-dominated church, and it was clear that her own passionate views on the issues had propelled her to follow up so candidly and so fervently. I've also been providing in-person and telephone and email updates to the participants with respect to the progress of data collection, but at this stage, in terms of publications, they always are aware of the different conference papers that I'm presenting. They're very aware of what's happening this evening as well, and I received a lot of very precious communications and words of support and prayers to minimize my stress related to the live streaming. And they also read and approve the journal articles, as I mentioned, in the manuscript for the book. And this has been very meaningful conversations that we've been having with these women in these post-interview dialogues. And I think this ongoing communication and the inclusion of the sisters has fostered very valuable continuity that has enhanced the manners in which their own voices and experiences and meanings have been conveyed. So it's been quite meaningful, but it's also been quite productive at the same time. Oops. There we go. So throughout this project, I intended to counter many problematic stereotypical assumptions about the Catholic nuns that have constructed often inaccurate and even inappropriate images of who sisters are and what they do, or perhaps more interestingly to some, who they are not and what they don't do. I admit that despite my relatively close affiliation with some women religious throughout my lifetime, I too held certain views and understandings of what nuns represented and what they were allowed to think, say, or do. Yet as I worked alongside some of them in the areas of human rights, social justice, and international development, both in Canada and abroad, I started to hear some rather surprising feminist opinions and observe some rather progressive, leading-edge, and resistant-oriented actions that I didn't expect. There were moments when I would say, did she just say what I think she said? Did she just do what I think she did? And I came to discover that these women are much more complex and courageous than most people probably realize. So I set out to learn more about who they really are and what they really do in the 21st century. And as I did, I also learned more about who they are not, or at least who they are no longer, and what they don't do or no longer do. And the image on the cover, I think, is symbolic of such realizations of who they are not and what they don't do or no longer do, and what they have turned away from and what they have moved beyond, as illustrated, what I think, by the darkness of what's behind them on the figurine. While the front side of the image is illuminated by either a sunrise or a sunset, it's indicative of what they have turned towards. Clearly something brighter, and such greater illumination is indicative of who they are and what they're doing. So I've organized this presentation by highlighting a few examples of the ways in which they've moved beyond and how they do so and what they're moving towards. So in terms of what they're attempting to move beyond, the first example pertains to patriarchal power and sexist stifling, and many of these have unfortunately led to various forms of victimization, and very painful ones, including Me Too accounts. So by way of meeting these sisters and understanding their perspectives and their feelings, I'm sharing a few quotations, and all of these are shared with pseudonyms that the sisters and I have co-decided. So the first example is shared from former sister Carol, who was 62 years old at the time of her interview, and she was looking back on incidents of sexual abuse from her earlier days at the convent. And she shared that some of my classmates were sexually abused by priests that were coming in to run retreats. I mean the gurus. I know of gals that have left because of it, and the convent denied them. One former sister is a bad alcoholic. I mean, she can't even be cured anymore. But she was abused by one of the priests. She worked at the rectory. A sad, sad situation. 68-year-old former sister Darlene did not experience abuse herself, but she was well aware that other sisters had, and that the implications were profound. She shared that one of our sisters has written in her will that she does not want a priest to officiate at her funeral because she was a pastoral worker and she was very disrespected by the church. This statement is undeniably compelling. A nun who refuses to have a priest preside over her funeral, I think, speaks volumes about the depth of the wounds resulting from patriarchal and misogynist attitudes and actions in the church. Dismissive treatment, generally, and women's exclusion from the altar specifically, have left many sisters feeling undermined intellectually, underestimated spiritually, and dislocated institutionally. 82-year-old Sister Sophie shared that we are ignored completely. We are really put down by the church, by the hierarchy. Whereas some sisters felt dismissed by verbal remarks, Sister Marian sensed a rejection by the overwhelming presence of male clerics. She recounted a paralyzing feeling when she entered a church to prepare as a reader during a mass, which was a task that she had been officially scheduled to fulfill. She shared that I opened the doors to go into the sacristy, and it was wall-to-wall priests and altar boys. There wasn't a woman. I froze in the doorway. It was like a wall. I turned around and left. Sister Marian's immediate exit from the sacristy resulted in her being deprived of the occasion to be both present and participatory near the altar up within the sanctuary. While her actions may be perceived as self-directed deprivation, the debilitating impact that the male-centric space had on her temporary immobility in the doorway cannot be overlooked. While some women religious feel angry and frustrated by the patriarchal control, others have felt silenced and stifled by it. Such a sentiment was expressed particularly by Sister Kelly, who referred to the male-led Mass as the most painful experience, and who declared that my desire to be a priest from the time I was little has never died in me. During our conversation, she also spoke of the profound impact that an image of the bent woman had on her as she reflected critically on her gendered position in the church. Referring to the description in the Gospel of Luke 4:13-11 of the woman who was bent over and quite unable to stand straight, Sister Kelly shared that it was a very emotional experience to see that woman, and it was just, oh God, that's how I feel in this church. That's what I saw in the church, and it just went through my heart. During her interview, I recall feeling puzzled as I heard Sister Kelly share about her bendedness and by extension her brokenness, because she spoke and wrote so openly and courageously about women's unequal position within the institutional church. Yet as I considered her words in greater depth, I was reminded that if a woman like Sister Kelly, who is outwardly confident and vocal in her critique against the church, and who seemingly has moved beyond the institutional church on so many levels by advancing numerous spiritual alternatives, can still feel so harmed and impaired, then the pain and pervasiveness of the church's patriarchal power certainly warrant much further scrutiny. Women religious Disregard of the Roman Catholic Church was also manifested through their disagreement with church teachings and practices which they felt comfortable asserting. 73-year-old Sister Loretta shared that, "I don't agree with the structures. There's a lot of things I just don't agree with. There's no dialogue, not listening to anybody, and I find it very dogmatic." 68-year-old Sister Adele shared that, "Lots of the ways that people pray as Catholics, I don't pray that way. Some of them I used to. Some of them I never did." And 64-year-old former Sister Naomi shared that, "It is a patriarchal and hierarchical institution and not indicative of gospel living. I'm ashamed to be associated with the institutional church, that is, knowing people who suffer from all the power, the use and abuse of power. So whether it's people who are feminists or people who are gay or lesbian or are divorced or people who've been abused, I find it very difficult to know the wrongness of what is happening and has happened there and still be associated with that same institution. That's very painful for me." And even though Naomi is a former sister, she is a very dedicated practicing Catholic and has focused a lot of her attention around social justice and is part of a fairly open-minded and leading social justice community within her area. Another example of how they're moving beyond pertains to their organizational structures. And I think their attitude towards this and their actions regarding this have been very indicative of their humble awareness of how problematic and stifling their own organizational structures were, and they're not afraid to admit it. And just recognizing that their own hierarchical governing arrangements were, borrowing a term from Sandra Schneider's, hyper-institutionalized structures. And Sister Loretta, who was 73 at the time of her interview, shared that many of the women religious I interviewed felt that the autocratic regimentation had crushed them, and this was Sister Naomi who mentioned this, or they had observed how others had really broken under the strictness of it, and that was what was mentioned by Sister Loretta. So now we'll turn to a few examples of how they've moved beyond. For one, they've engaged in various resistance tactics, including various disagreements and differing opinions. So many sisters have felt free to assert their disagreement. From 63-year-old Sister Jeanette, who shared, "I don't always agree with some of the statements that come out. I don't always have to agree with what the church is teaching." Some of the women religious move beyond disagreeing with the church's precepts and dismiss the church's hierarchical dimensions. For example, 71-year-old Sister Mabel offered a sharp critique that sets her apart from the stereotypical image of passive nuns and points instead to her spunky refusal to conform and to her ability to confidently release herself from clerical constraints. So she shared, "I bypass the other nonsense that goes on, the bishop, the Vatican, the whole hierarchical structure. I totally have absolutely no use for. I don't pay any attention to it. I haven't got time for that really, I just haven't got time for nonsense. I haven't got time for craziness, and like I said, it was craziness." One of the particular ways in which the majority, and 78% of the sisters and former sisters, have been demonstrating their disapproval of the patriarchal church is through their refusal to attend the annual Chrism Mass. A number of sisters expressed their frustration with this celebration, pointing particularly to its male-dominated nature as the key reason for their avoidance of it. So 72-year-old Sister Agnes shared, "I don't go to Chrism Mass. I can't. I just hate it with all that male stuff there." 80-year-old Sister Kelly shared, "Well, I haven't attended the Chrism Mass for 20 years. Such strategic boycotting in which sisters actually forego a religious celebration, particularly a liturgy that is part of the Easter Triduum, serves as a testament to the intensity of their resolve against the male hierarchy of the institutional church. Yet, as 74-year-old Sister Ella explains, complete avoidance is challenging. She shared that, "I have to make myself every other year go to the Chrism Mass just because it's a wonderful celebration. But it's still a male bastion." Sister Ella's account reveals how her choices as a practicing feminist Catholic remain filled with painful tensions. While she boycotts one year, her biannual attendance reinforces how she will not be deterred by patriarchal domination and exclusion. As such, while alternating between her feminist and Catholic priorities, she attempts to uphold her forward-thinking principles. In my conversations with women religious, including Sister Kelly, who contended that Rome, well, as far as I'm concerned, Rome has to go, I have frequently heard their condemning and often bitterly spoken references to Rome, which has become synonymous with the Vatican and the Pope, all implying a patriarchal faraway mission control, to borrow a term from Kalin. Whether communally or individually, women religious have circumvented or simply disregarded Rome's control in a variety of confident and creative ways. Yet similar to their avoidance of some masses and sacraments, including confession, sisters have chosen to elude the actual physical location of the Vatican itself because it's a space that constitutes the ultimate representation of the Church's patriarchal and pompous power. For example, while displaying considerable agitation as she spoke, 72-year-old Sister Clara clarified the way in which she and another sister had dodged the nuns' worship of male officials at the Vatican. And she shared, "I was so disappointed with the Vatican. My highlight was Florence with Michelangelo." Sister Teresa, who was a sister who, and part of a leadership team, had been to Rome a couple of times before she had a third opportunity. And she shared that the Vatican doesn't impress me. I've really been saddened by the opulence. It embarrasses me. And so as a leadership team member who had an opportunity to go to the Vatican for a third time as part of a celebration of the canonization of one of the Canadian saints, she actually gave up her chance to go to allow for someone else to have the opportunity, mainly because she just refused to be there for a third time. The sadness was just too overwhelming. The exploitation inherent in conditions of domestic servitude has been painfully obvious to all the sisters with whom I spoke. For example, when Sister Kelly reflected on being a woman within the church, she protested loudly, "We were slaves of the clergy. That's who we were." Many of the sisters I interviewed resisted exploitive conditions at the hands of the male hierarchy by withdrawing their domestic and secretarial services in parishes, yet often had been reprimanded for such tactics. Sister Kelly recounted that when the sisters from her religious community withdrew their services in parishes after Vatican II, they were treated harshly by the diocesan male hierarchy. She explained that when we decided that we were not going to do that anymore, oh my, that was terrible. Oh, the sisters, the sisters, the sisters. Oh my, oh my. Sister Kelly also recalled a particularly troubling patriarchal response against them. Another priest was heard to remark that he would put us in our place and we should put our veils back on our heads and get back into the convent where we belong. While such a reaction illustrates the repercussions that women religious have faced by male clerics when they withdraw from exploitive labor, it also reinforced the sisters' resolve to maintain their position of gender equality. So a few examples of what they've been moving towards. So the first one pertains to the feminist, feminine, and inclusive forms of spirituality. And there have been many forms where they prioritize women-led liturgies, women-centered liturgies, ones that focus on women's issues and the dignity and equality of women. And at the same time, they've also been reprimanded for many of them. So Sister Sarah, who's 49, remembered a degrading instance that transpired after she advocated for gender-sensitive language. She shared that I did have an experience when working with one priest in particular on a mission. There was an issue around inclusive language that I was publicly reprimanded for, and that was very humiliating. It was someone who really worked out of a very patriarchal model. Sister Mabel, whom you've heard of before, who's quite feisty in her commentary, who was a general superior, had lent her unconditional support to Sister Kelly, who was one of the sisters who was condemned as a heretic by diocesan officials for authoring a feminist-oriented book. So Sister Mabel shared that I expected the flack, and I told her, I'll stand by her no matter what happens. If that becomes an issue, because that's freedom of expression, I'll get expelled. I don't care. It would be a privilege. Sister Mabel's willingness to risk her membership in the institutional church by way of potential excommunication is indicative of the extent to which some women religious are prepared to circumvent the church's patriarchal constraints. Such tenacity can also be understood within the context of many sisters' contentment with their alternative spiritual and community pursuits through which they thrive beyond the institutional church. Many sisters spoke about the ways in which a lot of the decisions that they make and the actions that they engage in are partly based on the courage that they derive from the sense of community and the infrastructural support as a community that they benefit from. Sister Kelly explained how in the case of liturgical dance, another feminine spiritual practice, that despite the overall clerical disapproval, her religious community has kept the movement as part of their creative liturgies at Jubilee celebrations held within their own mother houses. She shared that they, the clergy, don't like it, but we do it. Sister Loretta also underscored her community's intrepid independence. We just do what we believe in and forge ahead. In some cases, as Sister Mabel stated, forging ahead implies selectively avoiding the bishop's scrutiny altogether. She shared that we don't show him the program, we don't show him anything, we just go ahead and celebrate and we get a priest that we like. Sister Agnes elaborated on another selective scheme that her religious community employs in order to evade the diocesan bishop. We just stopped inviting him. We try to arrange things when he's away if possible. We plan our jubilee when he's busy, out of the country, or at least out of the province. Sister Penelope revealed another avoidance tactic. We don't ask permission anymore, so we don't have consequences from the hierarchy. In terms of New Age practices, the sisters' strategies extend beyond their liturgies and also apply to the New Age practices that they offer in their retreat centers. Former Sister Darlene, who works at a spirituality center operated by a community of sisters, reflected on the sisters' strategic tactics to overcome church-imposed restrictions. This is in reference to the 2009 ban against Reiki by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So she explained that we have one person who does Reiki here, but it's off of our brochure now because the bishops banned it, but we still offer it during retreats. We just share it through word of mouth. Sister Mabel, a Reiki master, who at the time of her interview was too busy to offer it herself due to her employment responsibilities, also critiqued the ban and proudly stated that it continued to be practiced within her community's mother house. She shared, "I studied Reiki, I taught Reiki, I did a lot with the dying, and now that's condemned by the Holy Father. I laughed out loud that no one can do Reiki. It's a healing art that goes way back to the 13th century. I mean, the ban, it's crazy. We have Reiki tables, though, and Sister Hilda does Reiki here, too." In an effort to overcome the Church's broader control, many sisters have adopted the approach articulated by Sister Mona, who is a member of her leadership team, who explained that we have to move beyond what is specifically Catholic to the reign of God, which is something much bigger, and that is where we will find our way. So the sisters' emphasis on spirituality have certainly remained steadfast, while at the same time, many sisters' spiritual trajectories have taken them far beyond the institutionalized and therefore formalized Catholic altars. While they remain faithful, and albeit to varying degrees, to the Catholic tradition, they have also enriched their spirituality with other traditions, a testament to their ecumenical emphases, including Buddhism, Indigenous peoples' traditions, Islam, Judaism, earth-centeredness, spirituality, and cosmology, so not unlike many of their lay counterparts. Circular governance is another example of what they're moving towards. And this is a recall back to the concerns that they had expressed with respect to their previous hierarchical structures. So again, just being very aware and willing to admit that, I think, is quite important to recognize. And they've recognized, again, how problematic they were. And as a result, they have been working towards establishing circular governance and shared leadership, shared decision-making, consensus-based decision-making to ensure that they have as much of a democratic process as possible. And while not without challenges, the new feminist-informed decentralized governance through which the sisters' communities now operate has fostered a greater sense of inclusivity, which has translated into meaningful productivity on both individual and collective levels. And many sisters shared about how much they appreciated the opportunities to be part of the decisions, to not simply have to follow obedience or blind obedience, and to be able to contribute in terms of partnership with respect to decisions that are made as well. But many other sisters spoke about how not only have they brought this forward within their own governance structures, but they're also trying to model these similar types of circular decision-making within or among many of the groups that they're supporting or part of as well. And feminist activism is another area that they've been working towards. One area is certainly non-judgmental and compassion-filled stances on reproductive justice, as well as their concerns associated with the hypocrisy of the Church's positions on those issues. But they've also dedicated a lot of time towards prioritizing girls' and women's rights. So while in the past it's important to recognize that many sisters played an undeniable role in the conditioning of girls and women into gendered subservience, today, at least among the sisters I interviewed, they now proudly prioritize the empowerment of girls and women. I've seen firsthand, both in Canada and in many Latin American countries, the life-changing benefits of the educational and human rights projects for girls and women that are led by dynamic women religious, who often risk their own lives in order to carry out these projects. And these feminist-based shifts in their priorities and practices cannot be overlooked, and they should definitely not be underestimated by secular feminist activists either. I'd like to highlight a few examples of the strategic spaces and how they maneuver and negotiate some of the limited space that these women have within the church. While some women religious are known to have emerged from the shadows in order to assert their gendered rights within the Roman Catholic Church, others, like the majority of women I interviewed, prefer to work strategically within the shadows in order to maximize their potential without clerical interference. Such preferences were variously expressed by both current and former sisters. Rather than being deterred by patriarchal exclusion, Sister Nora readily flies under the radar in broader locations, and especially so that she can operate in what she refers to as a space of human situations beyond the institutional church. Similarly, Sister Sarah underscored both the intentionality and the necessity of working strategically and quietly in order to protect their endeavors. She shared that it causes a lot of conflict because there's a lot of good that's done under the wire that in some ways we would be jeopardizing by becoming so public. In terms of their critique regarding gender inequality within the church. And many sisters in our conversation shared that some of them had actually participated in protests on American soil or within the United States at various moments over various decades and standing up to concerns related to gender equality, not only at a societal level, but sometimes when the Pope has come or was visiting in the United States, some of the Canadian sisters I interviewed talked about how they had been present at one of the protests that had actually blocked the entrance of the Pope at one of the masses because they were concerned or expressing their frustration around the deprivation of the opportunity of girls to serve on the altar. And so some of the sisters were at the forefront of those protests, and the Mass only began once the clerical officials had agreed that girls could serve on the altar that day. However, in Canada, in light of Sister Sarah's comment, many of the sisters shared that despite their presence in various public protests for a variety of other societal issues, that they would never on Canadian soil conduct similar or be participants in similar protests against the church more specifically. And when I asked why that was, the response that I got was always, well, we're just Canadian. Yet they were willing to do so in another country. Comparably, the women's preference toward the periphery was also articulated imaginatively. While the marginalized status of women religious within the institutional church remains a serious source of contention, some women are actually more comfortable with both their conviction and their location. Former Sister Naomi shared that, or asserted that her people-based notion of church is just as valid as the institutional church, but that her vision, or her version, was just not on the power grid. Likewise, Darlene favored operating on the fringe as she worked within a justice-oriented sisters ministry that was just not part of the officialdom. By extension, Sister Ella illustrated that she eagerly works on the edge so that she can be away from the centers of power and thus more attentive to the people's needs. It may be difficult for many observers to comprehend such preferences, especially when frustration would be understandable reactions in light of the ongoing marginalization that is still quite prevalent. Yet such stances are illustrative of sisters' how they circumvent the patriarchal and hierarchical powers. Their approaches demonstrate how, rather than being stifled by their dislocation or discouraged by the undeniable and sometimes overwhelming constraints they face on the periphery of the church, many sisters and former sisters view this decentered position as ideal and capitalize on it, especially for the benefit of others. Thus, it is in the women religious's own recentering and reclaiming of both themselves and their work within decentered spheres that they serve as models of resilience and ingenuity. And by extension, they also serve as models of women-centeredness, productivity within their own spaces, far beyond the Roman Catholic Church's patriarchal altars. However forward-looking and productive sisters' current and future projects may be, there is still considerable cause for concern and room for critique, because it is profoundly disconcerting that women religious and other lay women are still on unequal footing within the Roman Catholic Church, and have thus still not yet achieved some of the most essential liberal and second-wave feminist goals within that religious institution. It's even more perplexing that women religious are still struggling against male clerics' ongoing efforts to delegitimate their women-centered initiatives and thus still feel compelled to be clandestine about their innovative endeavors. That women religious must still negotiate their place, both cautiously and creatively, in the 21st century is a testament to the extent to which patriarchal power of the Roman Catholic Church remains entrenched and intractable. Furthermore, while there maybe appear to be signs of hope under Pope Francis's leadership, there is still cause for concern. First, Pope Francis's mixed messages remain a source of confusion and frustration. While he has affirmed women religious, he did not put an immediate end to the investigation of sisters in the United States and instead appointed an overseer to monitor their compliance. In fact, monitoring continued well into the fall of 2016, in which approximately 15 religious orders from the United States were summoned to Rome over areas of concern, much of which were their feminist practices. We also cannot possibly forget that while Pope Francis authorized a commission to study female deacons, and it was indeed established in late 2016, women's ordination remains criminalized under canon law in the meantime. Relatedly, while Pope Francis is modeling and encouraging inclusiveness regarding a variety of social issues and among many marginalized populations, his refusal to open up to the question of women's ordination, including to decriminalize it or to integrate women more fully at decision-making levels, remains fundamentally problematic, as Joan Chittister has shared. Thus, while some doors may have opened, albeit partially, others seem to remain firmly closed, and as a result, both women religious and other lay women across all generations continue to hold second-class status, not only within the Roman Catholic Church, but also throughout the world. Second, while Pope Francis may have established a more open and inclusive atmosphere generally, albeit relatively in some regards, there is no guarantee that he represents a future trend in papal leadership in the Roman Catholic Church. Just as we have seen in earlier decades, the undercurrent of anti-feminist conservatism and misogyny, both within the Church and society, as we've seen, has resurfaced at various moments and often vehemently. While the contested terrain between male clerics and women religious remains, it is nevertheless a future that remains hope-filled, particularly in the short term due to the sisters' steadfastness. Although their advanced ages and declining numbers point to an inevitable demise of women's religious communities in their current form, that demise may neither be imminent nor absolute, given that many women religious are still quite active as third-agers in their retirement years, including some of whom in their mid-90s are serving to advance spiritual renewal, as well as social, ecological, and gender justice. Their interim impact is certainly worthy of observation, as their spiritual and societal footprints will undoubtedly be evident, effective, and enduring. The sisters' careful and creative entrustment of their charism and legacy onto others, including their associates and beneficiaries, will serve to extend the permanence of their presence and the effectiveness of their engagement over the long term. The potential of that permanence and effectiveness is further propelled by the sense of hope inspired by the sisters as they point to other possibilities, and particularly inclusive ones, beyond the institutional church. As 80-year-old Sister Kelly shared, "I trust that the Spirit will move us. It will take time, but I think there is a groundswell in the grassroots of the church, in the underground church, that is not going to be stemmed. I do have hope for that. I believe that there is a movement, first of all within individuals, and individuals come to consciousness before groups. So it will take a while, but I believe that patriarchal, hierarchical governance, either in the church or in society, the problem's not going to be solved in them. It's going to be solved in the feminine, in those of us who see otherwise, both men and women." When Cheryl Reed, who is an author of sisters' work within the United States, in 2004 reminded us over a decade ago that women religious are the Catholic Church's biggest and littlest known asset. She also contended that since sisters offer a sense of church outside of the male hierarchy, then if there is any hope in the Catholic Church for women, it is through the nuns. Sister scholars and authors like Sandra Schneiders, Elizabeth Johnson, and Joan Chittister echo such a contention, as well as Sister Kelly's proposed resolution in the feminine, as they assert that the quest for gender equality can and should be led by women religious, who are uniquely and institutionally placed both to experience the multiple frustrations that women religious feel, that women generally feel within the church, most acutely, and to be motivated to bring to bear feminist creativity and insight in order that their contributions might flourish despite the constraints of their institutional position. No matter how elderly the women religious featured herein may be, as midwives of new ways, which was an expression by Sister Adele, there is undoubtedly still much to which we can look forward, as their leadership is not only promising, but actually also proven. The transformative potential of their interwoven, women-led spirituality, governance, and activism remains propitious, given that as 75-year-old Sister Edith reminds us, the sisterhood is strong, and as 74-year-old Sister Ella proclaims, we are just indomitable, really. Thank you. So I can try, I think this is on.
So Christine's willing to have some conversation and take some questions. So we have microphone on each side. If you don't mind waiting a second for the microphone to come so we can all hear your questions or your comment. And then I'll let Christine manage that on her own. Yep.
I'm aware that Sister Joan Chichester has taken a new tact in the last 20 years by attracting young women who were, I think, manifesting a desire to serve the church, and she feeds them with the Monastery of the Heart. You aware of that program? I would like for you to comment if in Ontario there are similar programs. That's my first question, if you ran across it. And secondly, what about things that routinely have taken place in the last 25 years, like in the St. Lawrence, away from the diocesan control? Would you speak to that, please?
Yes. All right. Thank you for your questions. I'm less familiar with Sister Joan's project, and I'm not familiar with any in the province of Ontario. But what I have been told by various congregations, especially the ones whose sisters I interviewed were part of or members of, that many of them are not recruiting young women, in part because many of the young women, and these were the sisters' opinions, who are intending to join communities have tended to be more conservative. And the types of communities that the sisters represented in this project are, in their opinions, more social justice oriented, more feminist, more inclusive, and are not necessarily responding to the interests of these young women. And so rather than changing back to the pre-Vatican ways, they would prefer to continue on with their feminist, inclusive, and social justice lenses and actions, and accept the inevitability of their demise rather than recruit these younger women. So they're often referring them to other communities that they think they'll be more corresponding or resonating with their interests. With respect to the ordination of women, and you're talking about well, what some women are considered to be, the rebellious faction of the women's ordination. I'm familiar with many of the women who are part of that. And so these are women who are similar to other priests and other women across the world who are reprimanded for those actions. So as much as they're moving forward and have the courage to do so, there's certainly considerable backlash in that regard. And so some sisters and women, and lay women, as well as priests, have already been excommunicated for having supported women's ordination in the United States, and not so much in Canada specifically, but there's certainly many concerns with respect to how people are being treated for that. So it's an interesting movement, but one that is certainly, again, facing backlash by the church.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just recovering from a sore throat here, but I'm just wondering, interesting talk. I'm just wondering if you have any testimonials from other sisters or nuns from other orders that actually are in support of the church's hierarchy or male dominance per se. And if you can share some of that with us, because I think that, of course, I understand that this is covering one side of the story, but I mean, I think I'd be hard pressed to say that, part of my intellect is saying, but what about the other side of the story, and what are these women saying? Because I personally know several sisters who are in love with the system as it is right now and would not want it to change at all. And I just want to hear that side of it, please.
Yes. So thank you for your question. I certainly understand it's definitely a fair one. And so I didn't hear from sisters who shared those opinions, with the exception of a couple who had perhaps a more mediocre affiliation with feminism. So they certainly believed in gender equality, but they didn't, like many other sisters, identify specifically as feminist. And the project or the study was open to all sisters. There was no recruitment exclusion criteria whatsoever. So I can't necessarily comment on why other sisters didn't participate or respond to participate, because it certainly wasn't a feminist intended or solely feminist project. It was welcome and open to everyone. The sisters who I interviewed spoke about sisters within their community. So despite many of their leadership teams having established and maintained a more feminist, inclusive approach, that there were still some sisters, and not necessarily older sisters, as one may presume, who were feeling quite comfortable, as you mentioned, with the status quo. And so many of the sisters spoke about some of the tensions that emerge in different conversations, and even around this project, as some sisters or any publications that may have circulated within some of the communities or their mother houses. And if a sister who was less inclined in terms of feminist lenses came across it, sometimes there would be tense conversations about the content and the approach as well. And some of the other sisters also talked about how some of the sisters who they felt were not necessarily moving forward in inclusive or were not fully pro-gender equality, the community often struggled with their stances, and so the tensions remain, and it's not that they were expecting them to change necessarily. There was a very important acceptance and a mutual respectful acceptance of differing opinions, but definitely having recognized that there are still sisters, even within the communities that I represented, again, despite the leadership teams having a more open and inclusive stance, that we're still, again, wanting to maintain the status quo and quite comfortable with it. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but yes.
First, I'd like to thank you for a very moving presentation and for sharing information that I think is very much needed to be heard.
Thank you.
If I remember correctly and heard you correctly, in the very beginning, you said that one of your reasons for wanting to publish this book was to communicate to young women in the church that their concerns are matched or mirrored by these older women. And I was hoping you could say something more about what you understand about the younger women's concerns.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly similar frustrations with respect to gender inequality, feeling excluded, feeling like they have a place within the church, and many, unfortunately, having been raised as Catholics, are struggling with their commitment and their membership within the church, and many of them have left or are partially involved, similar to some of the sisters as well. And if I may relate to some of the young women whose experiences were very meaningful and very much connected with this project, were some of the research assistants who worked with me at the university, and all of them were from the Catholic tradition. And so their insights were quite meaningful. And so many of them, I often recall hearing them commenting about, as they were working with transcript material and hearing the sister, referring to the sister's comments and so on, were so buoyed by the courage of the sisters that they were reading or listening to as they were transcribing, and just echoing. And we had really meaningful conversations about what this meant to them and what they were learning from the sisters. So for them, it was very affirming and validating as well. So that was within the immediate circle. I've spoken with other young women about the implications of this, and even just in general conversations, unexpected conversations, serendipitous ones sometimes, just in public spaces, or even in my classrooms at the university when I've referred to sisters' experiences around various themes, even within criminology. I'm always encouraged and intrigued how many of the young people, including both young men and women, and especially young women, ask really interesting questions or come up to me after class to the podium to thank me for having shared these concerns and raised these particular issues. And sometimes within academia, we hesitate to talk about religion or spirituality, and having many of these young women come up to me afterwards and follow up with conversations or send emails requesting copies of publications and so on. It's really encouraging to see how these concerns resonate with them, and that it's not something that they necessarily expected to be speaking about, but it's certainly something that's touched them in a way. And so to hear how, again, there's a kind of a correspondence with their frustrations and concerns is something that they're recognizing as important. And so again, trying to follow up and having them talking about conversations after they've heard me speak about them with their grandmothers and with their mothers and other elderly female relatives and so on, to gain a better understanding of what their realities have been over the years has been very meaningful. So thank you.
That's great, thank you. Just to reiterate from your last point, is it allows space for people to be heard. And I think for these young women who are really in a crisis of spirituality, and not just women, but many of us, I'm wondering the sex scandal, and I'd like your perspective from your other hat too, from the litigation side. I can only imagine as women and the nuns, many of them are turned upside down with the trauma and the pain that has been caused to many people because of the sex scandal and the lack of transparency. One of the areas that most concerns me personally is the lack of reaching out to support the victims, and a lot of focus on maintaining the institution and the power and the ego. And given that we have these inspiring women who have a mission to serve in a very real way, I'm curious what type of conversation happened regarding the sex scandal.
There were many. Thank you for the question and for the comments. There were many sisters who struggled and shared very emotionally the pain that they had suffered themselves, either directly or having come to know about harms that were caused to children who were in their care as educators. So some sisters spoke about how they didn't realize, as in their role as chaplains, how when they would organize different priests to come to the school for confessions, how they were, again, realizing later how some priests would ask for particular positions or places within the library, which they then realized later were clandestine spaces or spaces where they could have easier access to some of the boys who were there for confession. And so they, again, reflected on the regrets of not having realized that. A lot of sisters actually spoke about how their own relatives, including many of their nephews who were altar servers, had been victimized, and how they had to guide their family through those particular struggles. Many sisters in their work as counselors and spiritual direction have also cared for many individuals who've been harmed by priests. So it's certainly emotional labor and spiritual and psychological care that they've provided, and it certainly has taken their toll and really underscored their frustration and reminded them of how significant and extensive these problems were. Other sisters talked about how they were frustrated that the priests who would be in their communities or convents or retirement residences, who would be serving or presiding over their masses on a weekly basis, were often priests who had been accused of sexual abuse, some of whom have been convicted, others not necessarily, but were certainly being hidden away. And so because they weren't able to be in public spaces, a lot of nuns complained how they had been sent to the nuns to say mass for them. And that stirred a lot of concern for them in multiple ways. So just the fact that they were present, although many of them had also spoken about compassionate responses and the importance of reconciliation and recognizing how these men had been struggling and grieving in the aftermath of disclosures and so on. So there was the compassionate element. But some of the others spoke about how they felt even more frustrated that their mass had to be presided by these men when there was a room full or a chapel full or a church full of very capable, well-educated women with degrees and doctorates in theology, spiritual direction, and many other disciplines that could have easily allowed them to lead the Mass, share the homilies, yet the irony and the frustration with this presence, and that they had to have a male present doing so, and one who was accused of these very harmful behaviors. So a lot of sisters struggled with that dimension of their presence as well. So I'm not sure if that answers your questions, but there were certainly layers and layers and many different examples of that frustration in recognizing, again, the extent of the harm. A lot of sisters, and this is not to undermine the sexual abuse against children, but a lot of sisters, as in many other authors within the United States have drawn our attention to, is that many women, in some of the anecdotes that I began with, that the sexual abuse against women and adult women in the church is quite serious and has been quite serious. And it's not, again, to prioritize one over the other or to see that one is more important, but many of the sisters or women, adult women's or young girls' stories have been lesser known. And there are even authors within the United States who claim, based on their research, that the sexual abuse against adult women in the church statistically there's a higher representation of that compared to the sexual abuse that children have suffered. Yet it's not a widely known issue, and it's certainly not come to the attention as it has. But and rightly so, we need to be paying attention to the concerns related to children. But the stories of the adult women haven't become known, and similarly, the reparation or the support and counseling that's required for them has therefore also not been taken care of. So there are, again, many layers of complication here.
Thank you for bringing this forward. It just, as my sister said earlier, it just validates kind of how we're feeling, but it's so good to hear it out in public. And so thank you for writing your book and for speaking about it. I know there are movements in the States where, you can kind of join and there's power in numbers. And are you aware of anything in Canada or in Ontario that we can help put our voices behind what's being said here?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's certainly the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, which originally was developed to address the issue of women's ordination, but it's certainly become more diversified over the years and focusing on all aspects of gender inequality within the church. So there are different chapters across the country, some in Ontario, but again, from east to west, there's representation. They have an annual conference that is located in different parts of the country as well, so I can perhaps provide information. It's known as CANWE for short, but the Catholic Network for Women's Equality. There are other American-based organizations or internationally based organizations like Voices of Faith that prioritize gender equality as well. And there are Canadian chapters or Canadian individuals who are affiliated with them. But from my understanding, the Catholic Network for Women's Equality is probably the most active one. And many sisters, if they're not currently part of it, have certainly been part of it over the years. So there have been many members of CANWE who've passed away, and some of them, unfortunately, have been former nuns or former nuns. You're welcome.
So I too would like to thank you for sharing your research and your conversations with the nuns, so many nuns, and giving us an insight into your book, Beyond the Altar. As I was listening, I couldn't help think of the sequel to Beyond the Altar, perhaps being Beyond the Patriarchy. But I couldn't, as I was listening intently, I couldn't help, as a male Catholic of the gender male, I couldn't help think that your reference constantly to gender equality, it's in the context of the gender being either clerical or, let's call it, patriarchy, or the church's male dominance, when in fact, as a male Catholic, I too, and there's several men in this room that I know and have known for a long time, who would probably share my sentiments that that we too have no use for patriarchy and for the male, whatever you want to call it, in the church, and the wrongs and the arrogance and so on. So the point here, the question really is, and I will say one other thing, I'm not alone in this as a male, but I had my first intersection at the age of 5 years old with a nun who welcomed me at the door of junior kindergarten. And it was not a priest, it was a nun. And she was an amazing woman. I have never, ever forgotten her, nor countless other nuns that educated me. So I feel that I am part of your pain and part of your and part of the nuns' context of pain as a male Catholic. So the question, I suppose, I always move to, where are we going from here? So the question I have of you is, do you think or do you feel that perhaps at some point it would be constructive, it would be informative, it would be collegial, collaborative, to not constantly pivot against the clergy and the patriarchy, but embrace countless, thousands of men who share my sentiment, and learn from, we're not another gender, we're the male gender. Have a sense of kind of engagement with us. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you contemplated in your studies?
Absolutely. And Sister Kelly, I think, affirms that in what she shares about how the responsibility is for both men and women, that we'll come to this realization and see the change as possible if both are part of it and both realize the dual roles that we all play, regardless of gender. As you were speaking, I was reminded of the work that I do in children's rights and gender equality in Latin America, and organizing various workshops on human rights and children's rights and women's rights in particular, and how it is so important for young boys and men to be part of the conversation and to be informed about their rights. And in different projects that I've worked on in countries like Bolivia and in Honduras, where we've seen incredible changes in young boys and in some of the husbands or partners of some of the female or girls and adult women workshop participants, where they've come to realize, just after having an opportunity to listen to the pain and the struggles of their friends and their spouses and their sisters and cousins, and then afterwards acting on that knowledge and trying to bring about change within their own families and being more respectful of their mothers and more respectful of their sisters and their female friends, and husbands being more respectful of their partners or their spouses. And so it's absolutely essential for us to all work on this together. And I think that in many ways, and both within and outside of the church, if gender equality is to be achieved, it requires males to serve as models of that equality. And I talk about, at the end of the acknowledgement section in the book, the role that my husband plays within our family. He's modeled gender parity to our two sons in ways that I think that should be emulated, or at least copied, or recognized as important by male clerics, and to see the benefits and the rippling effect of that, is incredible in many different ways. And so I think there's a responsibility on all of us. And many sisters, in fairness to many priests, talk about how many priests have shared with them in private their pro-feminist ideas, their preference for gender equality, their interest in supporting women's ordination, but they're not allowed to do so publicly. And so there again is the silencing by the institutional church that is stifling everyone in that. So again, having opportunities for us to dialogue and share this more openly, and to have, even some sisters more recently have shared as part of the Me Too movement about their own experiences of exploitation in terms of labor, but also in terms of sexualized violence by priests. And to perhaps this is a key moment for us to all contribute to that conversation. So I think the more that males speak up and speak out and speak loudly in spaces and places and in times where perhaps it is too difficult for women to do so, can really open up possibilities. And again, to stand as models for the priests, for the male clerical hierarchy of the church, for the cardinals, the archbishops, and so on. I think if more men within the church, to whatever degree their membership is, can express that concern and not always have it come from the perspective of frustrated women and women who are hurt, can be very, effective. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your opinion too.
I'm wondering if any of the sisters spoke to you about the reasons to stay, why to stay in the Catholic Church. We heard a very interesting nun speak at Theology on Tap in Guelph about 6 weeks ago, surrounding the revelations in the sex scandals, and a lot of the issues that have come out in the revelations from residential schools, and all of the other difficulties that have come up in the last few years. And I have to admit that I was going to that talk hoping that she would have some stronger suggestions about what we can do for change within the church. And prayer and writing letters just doesn't seem like enough to me. I don't really understand like why more of us wouldn't just say, I refuse to be a part of this. I refuse to be a part of an organization where women are not equal. I have 2 daughters and a son that I actually said to them, I don't really want you to get confirmed. They go to Catholic school, but I said, I think you guys really need to think about this. I did it because it was expected of me, and I do have a very strong faith, but there are many other Christian institutions that value and promote gender equality. And my husband, my son, my girls, they feel that way. And I just think, why do the 5 of us want to claim to be Catholic? Why do we want to prop up this patriarchal organization? And so I'm just curious to know, for men and women who really disagree with these key messages that are being broadcast around the world, that if you say you're Catholic, this is part of what that means, even though it's not for many of us. But it's like the one nun said to you, I'm embarrassed that part of that is part of, if you say that is part of your faith, that you're associated with some of those beliefs. So I'm just wondering if the nuns said anything to you, like, why stay?
Yes, they did. There's an entire chapter in the book on that subject. For many of them, it was extremely difficult. It was very painful, and there were constant reminders of those tensions as they went about their, daily lives and different decisions that they were making. Part of the reason that the majority stayed, at least amongst the sisters I interviewed, was because of the very safe spaces that their congregations provided them. Safe in terms of broader spirit and more inclusive and feminine spirituality that were being promoted and prioritized, safe in terms of a financial infrastructure that protected them, that allowed them to carry out many of these initiatives and having them sponsored by their very own communities, but safe in terms of them not having to be fearful of losing their jobs or losing their livelihood because of potential repercussions, as is the case for some women in secular spheres. So many of the sisters spoke about how they are actually no longer that Catholic or as Catholic as they may have been when they first started out or as when they were younger, similar to what you were mentioning. And that their faith has really evolved and has become very eclectic and ecumenical and drawing from many other sources of spiritual traditions to enrich their Catholic faith, but also to diversify it. And so they, having sisters, or to see how sisters stay and to learn from them. Again, I think many of their experiences are very similar to ours, but they're also able, because of their communities, to carry on and to carry many of their ideas forward, but unfortunately they remain clandestine. So part of my frustration in hearing often about so much of the great work that these women are doing spiritually in terms of activism was that a lot of what they offer within their spirituality centers, because it is not seen as legitimate, is not being promoted in church bulletins or in church parishes during the announcements or on the back of bulletin boards in churches. So many of us are not familiar with what these women offer, and what I think so many of us would really appreciate in terms of spiritual learning. And in the many retreat centers or spirituality centers that I walked into across this province, I saw more yoga mats. I didn't see Reiki tables particularly. I heard of them, and many of them were very proud to count out how many they actually had. But more yoga mats and new age practice material than I saw of crucifixes and statues. And so these are women who are offering really interesting and life-changing healing services to many individuals. But again, because Reiki having been banned as one, these are not promotable, or at least chosen not to be promoted within parishes, so there's a loss there as well. In relation to your question, what often comes to mind as I think about this for myself and for others who ask the question is these women have modeled incredible resilience and resourcefulness, but at the same time, they've remained within an institution. They've chosen to be clandestine, especially the Canadian sisters, not so much the American sisters, but the American sisters have paid a price for their outspokenness and their feminist ideas. In their defense, or as they defended themselves through those investigations and the apostolic visitation, their response was, we did what you called us to do after Vatican II or through Vatican II, but apparently they went a little too far, according to the male clerics. And so many of their feminist ideas are ones that are promoting inclusivity and being compassionate and being careful in terms of how they're not judgmental with individuals who are struggling with various decisions, including reproductive rights. And yet again, they're reprimanded for that. So I think the Canadian sisters are interesting because they're modeling this resourcefulness and this resilience and feminist spirituality and governance and activism, but at the same time, they're not being as outspoken as it would be preferred that they could be. So by remaining clandestine and in some ways secretive about what they're doing, they've made a decision to not be out there and not be as public. But they're also doing that in part because they're concerned about being reprimanded for it. Many of them also spoke about how they worked for years and years and poured so much energy and emotion into trying to see changes within the church. Many of them were members of CANWE, the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, or other movements where they were hoping to see changes. And so many sisters talked about, the 1970s was a key time for women's ordination. And they really thought that they would see that within a relatively short period of time afterwards, and didn't. And then for many of them, as I mentioned, the few examples of having been reprimanded are just a few of the many that are featured within the book. And so for so many of them, they were just so discouraged by the public humiliation and the constant tensions and reprimands by bishops and priests that it's almost as if they gave up, or at least resigned themselves to being strategic within the spaces that they could control and manage for themselves. So in some ways they're important models, but at the same time, the ways in which they've stayed are not necessarily as transformative outwardly for all of us to benefit from. So there's a bit of a tension or limitation in terms of how they've done that. Still exemplary nonetheless.
Can I just ask one last question? Follow up to what Raymond said and what was so beautifully stated by the last question.
Yes.
Will committed Catholics rise up against this? Will we as a group decide this is wrong? We love our church. We love our faith. We're losing our children.
Mm-hmm.
What's it going to take for all of us to get going?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important and very important question. Many of us do so, as many sisters do, Canadian sisters, rise up and speak out on ecological justice issues, on gender issues in secular society or society generally, and they're not afraid to do so pertaining to those issues. But they're very cautious about not doing so with respect to the church. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do so. And I think what is unfortunate is that rather than remaining and trying to change, many people are leaving, but not necessarily replacing it with an alternative source of spirituality. Many people are, for sure, and many people are going to other churches. There are many sisters who I interviewed and former sisters who are part of other faith traditions officially. And so that's not leaving a lot of space for key leadership to initiate or to move that transformation forward. So I would echo your call to action that there is a responsibility. Why do we do it for so many other social issues, but we're not doing it within the church? And in fairness, many people are and have, but change has been slow to come, so people are discouraged by that and move on elsewhere. So if it is something that we want to preserve, then it's definitely something that we're all responsible, both men and women, both lay as well as religious, to move forward. Oh, there's one.
She's still going to be around for another little bit, so you can have some personal conversation. But before we get there, I'd like to invite forward Annie Denemy. She is the program head in religious studies at Monsignor Doyle Catholic Secondary School, to formally thank our speaker for all of us.
Good evening. I'm honored to have this opportunity to thank Christine for her openness and honesty in addressing a topic that is quite challenging and an area that many of us continue to struggle with. Tonight, we have heard about many courageous women who are working hard for change and are fighting for gender equality. You've given us many concrete examples of what a feminist spirituality might look like, and your approach to empower these amazing women religious to share their stories is truly inspiring. You've asked us to consider the stories of those who have been excluded in the institutional church. You've shed light on their pain, their spunky resistance, and their resolve to create an inclusive spirituality that moves beyond the altar and builds the reign of God. Christine, we appreciate the time you've shared with us this evening, and we are truly grateful for this chance to engage in such an important conversation on the role of women within the church, with the hope that we can build a church that is truly one of justice and peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. So just a couple of quick announcements before we finish up for the evening. First of all, we send out regular emails about upcoming speakers. If you're not currently on our mailing list and you would like to be on receive information about this lecture series or other lectures and events that are happening at the university, there's a sign-up sheet at the welcome table in the atrium. And every year, we're very happy to be able to present this program of speakers to the community. And it's because of the generosity of so many different partners and supporters. If you too would like to support the lectures, there are also some donation envelopes available at the welcome table. If you missed it on your way in, on the way out, you can stop at the table where our Social Justice Committee is selling some fairly traded products. And you know, you need some stocking stuffers and things for Christmas, so you might want to check that out. We're happy that our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Book, is also with us again this evening. So please visit their table, and they have copies of Christine's book there, and Christine is happy to talk with you, sign those books after we finish up right here. The next lecture in Catholic Experience is going to take place on Friday, February the 1st at 7:30 p.m. Jonathan Holmberghausen is a PhD candidate in Hebrew Bible at Duke University, and he's going to be here to present a lecture entitled Illuminating Justice, the Ethical Imagination of the St. John's Bible. So in this talk, Mr. Holmberghausen will show us how this St. John's Bible is a call to social ethics for the 21st century, as it intertwines both beauty and justice, especially in terms of justice for women, care for creation, and a dialogue between Jews and Christians. And the last thing is to say thank you to all of you for coming this evening. It's good to have you with us, as it always is. Thank you for whatever you do and however you help us to spread information about this lecture series. I hope I will see some of you back here at the beginning of February. But until then, we wish you and your families the very best blessings for this Christmas season. Have a safe trip home, and good night.